Hello, welcome to Inspiring Women with ADHD. I'm Renee Allen, the host of this podcast, and I have a guest here today. I'm so excited. Her name is Megan. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, Megan?
Absolutely. Hi. Thank you so much for having me. So my name is Megan. I am autistic and ADHD. I was diagnosed a couple of years ago, so I'm sort of a late realized person. But I've always been autistic and ADHD, and I am coming to terms with all of the stuff that means. I am an auDHD life coach for other people who either are autistic, ADHD, or are questioning whether they might be. And I love Star Wars, hence my Star Wars overall.
Oh, that's really great. I love it. I love it. I love it. I love being warm. I'm usually cold, so I'm usually cozied up in something. But I am so excited you're here today. I'm curious if a lot of the women that you work with are diagnosed as women too. Is that common?
Yes, a lot of the people I work with are late diagnosed, late realized. A lot of people I work with are self-diagnosed, and a lot of people I work with are women, non-binary, and I work with a couple of men, but I don't tend to attract men quite as much.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, you never know who you're going to attract, and some different than others. But yeah, it's interesting because very few are diagnosed as girls when they're young. So, and yeah. I like that you said some are self-diagnosed because it's not necessary for everyone to be officially diagnosed to understand how their brain works and everything. So I learned about Megan. She has a YouTube channel called Neurocuriosity. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And even just the name before knowing who you were made me excited because I have such a curious mind. Like I couldn't go on until I asked, are a lot of them diagnosed as children? Because that's one thing that I love. I was just telling my cousin that this morning because she has a daughter that has ADHD. And she said, I wonder if she's actually AuDHD. See, I keep saying it wrong. What is it? AuDHD?
Yes.
AuDHD. Yeah. She said, I wonder if she's AuDHD also. And I said, the great thing about learning you have a diagnosis or a disorder or whatever it is, a condition, is that then you can make sense of things. And I said, I almost feel sorry that you don't have one because then you can't figure out your brain as easily, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I love the entire concept of neurodivergence, not necessarily as diagnosis, but as deviation from the expected norm. And it really helps to know the patterns in which you deviate and the
cool.
ways in which you support.
Yeah. Oh, that's really great. Yeah, and it's fun to find out when your friends have a similar diagnosis or similar disorder, whatever it is, and to compare how it manifests for them, how their ADHD plays out or how their autism plays out. So that's really cool. What if women are listening who have ADHD and have never thought that they might have autism as well? Do you have any defining factors that are more like, well, if you don't do this, then if your brain doesn't work this way, you're more likely to have ADHD and not autism as well?
Ooh, okay. So I have a couple of thoughts on this one. First of all, nothing I say should be taken as diagnostic. I am not qualified to do that in any way.
Yeah.
With that in mind, though, I do think there are ways we can look at these, lenses we can look at these through. So the first thing I would say is there are, and I learned this from Leslie Side on TikTok, Leslie spelled Lesley. And she talked a lot about core features of an experience versus associated features. And how a lot of autism and ADHD have the reverse of each other. So autism's core features tend to be social difficulties and sensory difficulties, right? But associated with that can come emotional dysregulation and attentional problems and all this other stuff, right? ADHD, the core features tend to be attentional problems, emotional dysregulation. But associated with that, because of those things, we often also struggle socially. We can have sensory sensitivities and stuff. But it comes down to what is core to the experience versus what happens because of those core things. When you are AuDHD, it all feels core, right? It's all of it is central to who you are. And I will say, if you've ever thought well, I couldn't be autistic because, something I really encourage people to ask themselves is, okay, let's say you can't possibly be autistic because you like parties, right? My question for you is, how easy is it for you to attend a party? How many rules do you have around attending parties in order to make it fun? Because a lot of autistic people, first of all, we can mask, but also sometimes our ADHD swoops in and like will front for us while the autism hides in the corner until the autism can't do it anymore. And then it's like, okay, we're done, So basically, AuDHD looks really different than solely autism or solely ADHD.
Yeah, and I was learning just by listening to or watching your YouTube videos, and it's a misconception with ADHD too. I hear from a lot of women who say, I went to the psychiatrist and they said, you can't possibly have ADHD because you did so well in school. And I thought the same thing with autism. If you have autism, maybe you're not able to go on, although what's her name? The woman that went and got her doctorate that in like cows, and she's a very well-known. Yes, Temple Grandin. That's one of my ADHD things is I forget names all the time. Even if I know them, I've seen her movies, I've seen her. But yeah, Temple Grandin. She was probably the pioneer of showing I'm able to learn. I'm able to, contribute to the world with my knowledge. And I have a different brain than other people, different body.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think the idea that you can't be disabled and be smart, it comes from eugenics, right? It comes from this idea that disabled people are less than. And we just really want to fight that narrative. And we also don't want to swing too far in the other direction and be like, oh, like disabled people are okay because they can be smart. Like, no, like people with intellectual disability are totally valid and important as well,
Yeah. And sometimes your strengths enable you to do well, but that doesn't mean that you're not struggling in another way. To sit in that chair, to be around. I never had a problem socially, but the physical sitting still part or not talking, there are other things. And I know the social piece can be a big one too, or the sensory. My son, I remember his teacher said, if there's a fly in a room, I know there's no way he'll be able to pay attention to anything I say because he's following that fly, whether it's the movement, the buzzing, he hears things with the lights that no one else hears. Yeah. So, well, I know I'm asking all kinds of questions, but I mostly want to talk about emotional dysregulation because that is a big part of ADHD. And that's something that you know a lot about. And it was interesting learning from you because a lot of the response, I think, of a younger generation than me is feeling shame with that. Whereas my generation or older were kind of like, well, this is how I am. Or people would say things and you might feel embarrassed or teased, but you just kind of thought, well, I'm in that box. And you were still able to have some confidence with it. Does that make sense? And it seems like there's a lot, I don't know, maybe just the world reacts differently at different times, but I'm getting way off on this. But yeah, explain to me what emotional dysregulation is. I've talked about it a little bit, but which emotions seem to be impacted with managing those emotions for women, if there are more for one, gender than the other, or even just for having ADHD or not having ADHD. And is emotional dysregulation part of autism as well?
So it can be. It's not necessarily a central part, but it's the direct result of the central parts of autism.
Okay.
Emotional dysregulation is basically where you deviate from baseline very frequently and very extremely, and you have a hard time coming back to baseline. So it's totally normal for us to all deviate from baseline to a certain extent. Like no one's going to feel like neutral all the time.
And baseline is just having no emotion, or just kind of or is baseline more emotion within a range that people aren't affected by it, or you're not affected by it?
Baseline depends on the person. Like sort of like in the movie Inside Out, all of the people have a different emotion kind of at the helm of the emotional console. So everybody has a little bit of a different baseline, but generally it's when your emotions aren't distracting, they're not distressing, they're not like the star of the show at the moment.
Like, that makes me sad. And then that is a fleeting sadness. It's not soaking it in, storing it, overwhelming, that sort of thing.
Or that might even be like a really brief deviation from baseline where you're just like, oh, I'm sad and now I'm okay again. And like, that's not emotional dysregulation. Emotional dysregulation tends to look more like, oh, that made me sad. Oh no, I can't get out of it. I'm stuck down here. And then, oh wait, I feel way better and everything's amazing and I'm never going to be sad again. And then, oh my gosh, everything's terrible. And like kind of that whiplash feeling.
Yeah. What about if you have an emotion that's just stuck? It's stuck with you for days, weeks, which happens a lot with grief for sure. But it can happen with other things, anger, people who say, I just can't forgive people because it just becomes a part of them and it's driving them. Is that part of the emotional dysregulation as well?
I think it can be. I think having a hard time returning to baseline is part of emotional dysregulation for sure.
Oh, okay. And what do you think is a misconception about, well, first of all, I think probably most people, if they have a misconception about emotional dysregulation, they don't even have an awareness that there is emotional dysregulation. Does that make sense? So someone with emotional dysregulation, how would they be perceived by people like a school teacher, a parent, if they don't understand that their child or their friend or their spouse has emotional dysregulation? What are they perceiving? What are common things that are perceived and not helpful? And maybe that's just like you could talk about it all day, but I don't mind if you talk about it all day. However, you've seen that play out in your life, or of course, you're not going to talk about others' personal things, but just overall, because that seems to be, like, oh, this person's moody, or like you said, people told you were too sensitive. My daughter's been told that before, like, well, you're just too sensitive. You're just too sensitive. We talk about what's wrong with being empathetic, caring, sensitive, having things affect us emotionally.
Yeah, I think too sensitive, dramatic, moody. Sometimes you might even get labeled as manipulative, like you're trying to use your emotions to manipulate other people. There's lots of incorrect labels that get assigned to people who experience emotional dysregulation. And I would say the biggest misconception is that if you experience significant emotional dysregulation, then you must have bipolar disorder. I don't believe that that's true. I think some people have bipolar. It's a totally valid and real diagnosis, and it helps a lot of people better understand their experience. But I also know through experience that not all emotional dysregulation lines up with the criteria for bipolar.
Yeah, because when I first heard of bipolar disorder, it sounded like, oh, mood swings, roller coaster of emotions. When I actually looked up the symptoms or what qualifies as bipolar disorder, it was much different than something that simple. And I think a lot of people say, oh, I must be bipolar. I must be or question themselves if they have emotional dysregulation and not, or judge somebody in that way, which if it shouldn't be a judgment anyway, if somebody does have bipolar disorder, just kind of
I was misdiagnosed for years with bipolar disorder because my primary symptom, or the thing that was presenting the most problematically for me, was my emotional dysregulation, because I was doing well in school. I did have friends and relationships. And so they were like, okay, so the main problem is the emotional dysregulation. But what they didn't see is all of the trauma that was causing the emotional dysregulation, right? Like, my mood swings were not purely chemical, although there was obviously a chemical component, but they were often triggers. They were often autistic meltdowns. They were all these other things that, I don't even blame my doctors back then, because, I thought I had bipolar. We all did. Like, it just, that's what made the most sense. And so we worked with what we had. And I don't blame anybody for, like, if you have emotional dysregulation, assuming that you have bipolar, because that's what our cultural zeitgeist says. It's like, oh, if your emotions are all over the place, you must have bipolar. And like, there's so many other explanations, honestly.
Yeah. And I wonder if another judgment, I was thinking about this because my oldest daughter, who has ADHD, she was mentioning this the other day, and I was thinking she had this happen a lot, and it didn't happen to me, where people would say, oh, you're just doing this because you're seeking attention. Oh, you're just sad because you're seeking attention. She would even come in limping, and they'd think she was faking that. And I'm thinking, why was she always seen? She had a lot of friends. She did well in school. She wasn't somebody that anybody didn't like, but her friends, different people would say, and at the times, when the groups of friends are more catty and one person gets their feelings hurt, that was a common accusation to her. And I thought, I wonder if that was because her emotions didn't make sense to them, or that they thought, well, you must be doing this to seek attention. It's, no, this is just me. This is me.
And this is where we come into the neurodivergence being a deviation from societal expectations, right? There's a certain window where emotions are allowed to exist, and there are certain reasons emotions are allowed to exist outside of that window. If your emotions deviate from that window too often, or for reasons other people don't understand, people, instead of saying, oh, this person experiences emotions differently from me, the automatic reaction is, well, nobody could experience emotions that differently from me, so they must be faking, they must be lying.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, I have a background as a yoga teacher. I've attended a lot of workshops, trainings, and things on breathing for healing trauma. In fact, when you were talking about the bottom side up, is that what it's called? Which I love that too. I could talk to you about that another time. But, healing from the body up instead of the top down. I was thinking about yoga does that, breath work does that. And one of the things that I learned is in our society, in our culture, and I don't know what cultures still feel this way, or if there are any that don't, but we aren't comfortable with people crying. And we assume that if they're crying, they wish they could stop. And we're doing what we can to help them stop. Oh, no, don't cry. When someone starts to tear up, oh, no, don't cry. Or you look at them and you're uncomfortable because they're crying. Or you think, I'll put my arm around you so you could stop crying. When crying is supporting them in releasing and processing some emotions. And when I learned that, so much in the society, like, oh, that person just lost her mother. Let's give them some space. Let's not go to their house, which they could benefit by people coming and surrounding them with love and helping them, just sitting with them while they talk or cry. And I just thought that was really interesting because the more you learn about crying and breathing, there are breathing patterns that naturally happen in crying that are healing. And we stop people from doing that, or we think we have names like crybaby, or I don't know if people say that as much anymore, but crying can happen for so many reasons, even being happy. Being one of my daughters, we went on a trip when they were all young, all the way across the country not all the way, but from California to St. Louis and back. It took us almost a month and visited different people, saw different sites. And she is my emotion. What I always just thought, she's my emotional roller coaster child, and highs and lows and very high, very low. But we were able to work with that. It was probably harder for her, much harder for her than it was for me, because I understood that would happen and tried to support her. Here, let's do some art. She loved doing art. There were things that would help even her out and help her process things. But I'll never forget when we came back from the trip, she walked in and laid on her bed, and I'm thinking, let's see, we did this in 2002, and she was born in 92. So she was 10. And she laid on her bed and cried, but a joyful cry. I can't believe I'm home. I can't believe I'm home, and just sobbed. So it wasn't like she was sad, like I'm finally home. And she loved the trip. But the emotions that brought to be able to walk into the house again, and she, did it. And we were kind of like, oh, that's what she's doing. And I kind of just smiled with it. And at some point, my husband came in and said, you can't do this anymore. And, because maybe it was too much, sensitivity to him, the noise or whatever. But I thought it probably would have been nice to let her do that as long as she needed to do that. As long as she needed to do that, because that was her emotions just coming in full force,
Yeah, leaving space for emotion is really hard in our society that really doesn't prioritize space. It doesn't prioritize like what's called a liminal space, like a space between transition spaces. And like it really just wants you to be in one category or another. We do live in a society that really prioritizes binaries. And so like being in that liminal space of like, I loved the trip and I loved that I'm home and there's just a lot of love going on and it needs to come out some way. And crying is so needed.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm also curious about attachment. How, like, if you have a deep attachment to something, maybe like a lot of people do until you find out that you're different. But there's so many things that I assumed everyone experienced because some of these things ran in our family. You know, my grandma always would buy Christmas presents and lose them and not know where they were by the time Christmas. You know, when I started doing that, I thought, that's what my grandma did. My mom would lose things all the time. Oh, that's what. There were so many things that I would just look to a relative and think, this is normal, or this is what everybody does. And then also I've always been attached to memories, photos, reliving memories, talking about things, going back. I'd rather travel to see a good friend or a relative than go to Paris. You know, I don't care about those things. It means a lot to me to be somewhere where I used to live or something like that. And one day I was walking with a friend who had moved away, and we were going to go to lunch and then go to a yoga class where we both did our yoga trainings and we both attended classes there. She taught there, I taught there. And as we were walking, I think we were walking from the class to lunch, and I said, was it just amazing for you to walk in there and be in that space again? Because yoga people even, you know, like they're affected by space and experiences, because every time I walked in there, I thought of the people who did our training, the smell of the soap. I bought the same soap so I can always remember that, you know, I have all these attachments. And she said to me, she said, I don't get attached to locations or people. And I just thought, I didn't even know that was possible. And then I had another friend say to me, oh, that's right, you're one of those people. And she says it with love, and she has ADHD too, but she said, you're one of those people who like seeing people that you used to know. And I thought, I didn't know. So I'm curious how that attachment piece of me, who loves people so deeply and it's so hard emotionally when I'm not near them, how is that is that a part of emotional dysregulation? Because it feels like my emotions come in stronger than for a lot of people. And it doesn't, it can bring joy, but it also can bring a lot of pain. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think that heightened sensitivity can be part of emotional dysregulation for sure, where it's just like something small or something others perceive to be small happens. And for your nervous system, it's not that small. And I think that can absolutely be part of emotional, or can contribute to emotional dysregulation. But also, it's not something to necessarily be fixed if you don't want to. Right?
Yeah.
Like sometimes it's really, it comes with more pain, like you said, but it also comes with more joy. And sometimes the only way to reduce that is to start numbing or deadening things, which is not what many people want to do, although it can be like a survival mechanism. And that's, you know, whatever you have to do to be a person and be here is a good thing. So, but yeah, I think especially the difficulty not being around your loved ones, like that's a big thing a lot of ADHDers talk about, where it's like, I love my people so much, and when I'm not around them, my brain just forgets they exist, and like that's not what I want, and I feel like a bad friend. And you're not a bad friend. That's your brain just loves novelty and loves the current moment so much. We often have a hard time conceptualizing things outside the present moment.
Yeah.
And that's very ADHD.
Yeah. And you know what? It's funny because my friend that I was mentioning, he says, oh, that's right, you like to see people you used to know. She also has ADHD, but she's more like what you just mentioned, where when she's not around the people that she loves so dearly, she's not thinking, I need to call them, I need to write them, she needs to do the here and now. And I'm kind of like where I'm thinking about everybody all the time, but it's helpful to people because I do organize reunions. I do say, let's all do a Zoom call. We've had Zoom calls. We've had reunions with 8 friends, well, I guess 7 plus me, from dorms, you know, like 35, more than that, 38 years ago, you know, when we first met, because it lingers with me. And I don't think it bothers anybody, but it isn't something I think I've wanted to change. It's just that I've learned about ADHD and my brain a little bit more. I like the joy that it brings. I like the love that it feels, but it's just, I just have to realize that it's not going to be even. It's not going to be even. But I have seen the side, like my friend, when I was going to move away, when we lived together in the same area, she told me, I'm really scared because 3 other really good friends had moved away, and they were good friends of mine too. And she said they wanted to stay in touch with me. I didn't answer texts. I hardly, didn't call back. She said, and they had a hard time with that. It was very rare for her to stay in touch with them. And I don't want to hurt you too. And I said, oh, you have the right friend here, because not saying anything about the others, but I had been a letter writer growing up and would write people so much that if they didn't write back, one of my cousins said, I just feel so guilty when I get a letter from you, because I know I probably won't write back, or it might take a few times, a long time before I do. And I said, that doesn't bother me. I just feel in touch with you when I've reached out, because that connected us in one way. That was before email, text, or anything. And so I recognized that not everybody was the same in that. And so I told that friend, don't worry, I can call you 10,000 times as long as you're not bugged by it. And I won't be hurt, But I see that in my husband. We move away from somewhere and he's just like, I've shut that door. I'm not thinking about that house. I'm having people who go on walks by the house text me pictures because I'm curious what they're doing to change it. And I go, and he's just like, we don't live there anymore. I don't have to think about it. But yeah, it's an attachment thing, but it has its uses. And I guess that's probably what it's like for us, as we see what uses our emotions have and live with the ones that aren't as pleasant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I know when we moved houses recently within the last couple of years, as an autistic person, I really struggled with that, even though I was so excited to move to the new house. It's so much more space. It's beautiful. It's everything we did. We were so happy to get it. But I was super depressed for about 2 or 3 weeks after we moved. And it wasn't even necessarily because I missed the old house, although I did. It was just a big change. And my brain really struggles with big changes. And that's just something that's hard. And I'm like you, I drive by the old house sometimes. I don't even necessarily want to see what they're doing with it. I just don't mind the house now. But instead it's more of a, so much happened there.
It's a feeling. And I was just talking to my daughter about that, because she said, I don't know if I ever care if we go back to Santa Cruz, which was the last place we lived in California for 11 years. And, because she doesn't have friends who are there and stuff. And I said, for me, even just being able to get up and walk around, like the beach or wherever it was familiar, the smell of the air, the feel of, it's different where you are. You hear birds that you used to hear that you didn't realize here. It's just that high sensitivity and getting that enjoyment from it. But it's interesting when you were talking about change. I do have one child who was tested very high functioning, so not diagnosed as a child, but at the time, at least that time, they just said, we think he's on the spectrum, but not enough to test. And when we moved to a house, it was really interesting because we went there before we didn't move in months before. This makes sense. We bought the house, moved in maybe 2 months later, and we had some work done on the house in between that. And the first time that we went, which was my only time there too, there was a giant cabinet on the right side of the fireplace and there were windows on the left side. And my husband didn't like that cabinet. He's an artist. He's like, it has to be balanced. So he wanted that to be a wall and have that, those shelves taken out. And there was also a railing in the living room because it was step down. And you could walk by, and there was a railing. We thought, oh, that railing's not very pretty. So we had the railing taken out and steps all along that round part. So you could just sit on it, which ended up being really fun for people to come and, have lots of sitting space. We had that done, had new carpet put in because there were tons of pet stains and it smelled bad in there. But for at least a year, our son would say, why did you take out that shelf? Because when we went that one time, he took Hot Wheels and drove it on the railing and played with them on the shelves. And he talked about it. And I said, we didn't even live here then. He was there once, maybe for 2 days. And that change, and I even saw that in school, I would go to take the kids to school, and now I know because my ADHD, I forget to make lunches for him. So I go home, make lunches, show back up at the school, and one time I showed up, and he was walking out with his teacher for recess, for morning recess. And he said, "No, don't pick me up early." Like, that was a change if I were to pick him up early. And I said, "No, I'm just bringing lunch," but he wasn't supposed to see me that time of day. He wasn't supposed to go, and I'd see things like that. I don't know if you look back as a child and see lots of things like, I needed my schedule to be regular. I needed things to be predictable.
I think so, but I experience, like, I didn't need every day to be the same.
Yeah.
Like, my ADHD need for novelty was stronger than my autistic need for routine, if that makes sense. And so I didn't need every day to be the same, but like I needed certain things about my day to be the same.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm curious. I mean, I'm probably going to have to change the name of this podcast because I'm asking so many questions because I am so curious. And a lot of the listeners, one friend I was talking to was saying, I really want to listen to this because maybe I have autism too. Maybe so I've heard that ADHD, I've read that you can have sensitivity, but I know it's a much bigger part, like maybe it's more of a core thing for autism. But I don't think I have autism, but I know I have sensitivity. I've always had waist sensitivity to how my pants fit. And I was even thinking my leggings when I teach yoga, I don't like them to be close to my knees because I feel that behind the knee. And I've become more sensitive the older I get. And I'm just wondering, do you see that as mostly with autism, or you see it a lot with people who just have ADHD to a certain degree too?
So I think there's so much blooming research about this, like new research about this. So it's really hard to say anything for certain. I think it's pretty well documented that a lot of ADHDers have sensory sensitivities. Now, it's also pretty well documented that a lot of ADHDers are also autistic. So that could be that. But it might exist on its own. ADHD, a core part of it is that you don't have a very effective input filter, right? So all of the input kind of just hit you. And the thing about ADHD is that we are often very good at habituating, which means we like attune to stuff really quickly, which is why we can listen to the same song on repeat for like 6 hours because it becomes part of our environment,
Yeah.
But there are certain things that sometimes it just doesn't attune. And I think that's where some of the sensory sensitivities can come from, where that input, you can't ignore it because your input filter isn't working the way a lot of other people's input filters work. And so you can't ignore it, and it's not habituating, and it just becomes a sensory sensitivity. So it could just be part of ADHD for sure.
Yeah.
Or
yeah.
it could be an autistic thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think too, when you have a problem paying attention, and so many things can be a distraction, having my brain relax is so much better for me to be able to absorb what's going on. And I've learned mostly from my kids, because I think as you get older and your kids get old enough to criticize you and say, "Mom, don't do that." When they're little, they don't say that. Or when you don't have kids, people aren't saying it as much. But just going to a movie and someone sits in front of me, his head is a little bit high, like anything that's within that rectangle of the screen, if it's just a bit, even though I'm not looking at the bottom, it distracts me. And I think I can't relax and have a good time in this theater. And it's harder now because they do assign seats. So then I want to trade people places. And, but I've just noticed that about a lot of things, some sound sensitivity, but a lot of it is the visual. It's like I can pay attention if I don't see a mess between me and the TV screen. If I think there's something to do, then I'll get up and do it, and then I'll sit down, or I'll just move it out of the way. But it's that distraction piece for sure. So I'm curious, as an adult, someone who has problems with emotions, just going back to the emotions, staying at the baseline, what do you teach people when you work with them? Which emotions do you work with the most? Like, is there one or two that you work with more? And are there any strategies that you could give listeners for how to manage those when it's hard to regulate them. They're coming on strong. I know
Yeah.
it's a lot to put into a couple, minutes, but any little tips
Yeah.
that you have?
So I think the thing about emotional dysregulation is that it tends to affect all of the emotions. And that's why people have such a hard time, because it's like, well, I just don't want the bad ones. I want to feel the joy really strongly. I just don't want to feel depressed, and which is fair and valid, by the way.
Yeah.
But it just often doesn't work like that. So it usually
Mm-hmm.
affects all of the emotions. But I will say the one that I notice people coming to me for help with the most often is what I call like angry sads. Uh, where it's like very energetic sadness. It's really angry, upset, self-loathing, that sort of stuff. So people come to me for that a lot because it is hard to control, and there's usually a shame element, and shame makes the emotion even harder to understand and feel. So the tools I take people through, I have a course called Managing Mood Swings, and the tools I take people through are grief, sleep, and EFT tapping. So just like a quick rundown of those. Grief, the reason I teach that is because when you are emotionally sensitive, when you experience emotional dysregulation, there's a lot to grieve. Like there's a lot of you that was not accepted growing up and maybe still isn't accepted now. And there's just a lot of like loss of support that you could have, should have had, and we have to grieve for that. Sleep is because your life will change when you start getting enough sleep, if that's something that's possible for you. I know a lot of people experience different physical conditions that make sleep very hard, but if it's possible for you to get good sleep for the amount that you and your body need, whatever that looks like, it will change your life. Like in college, I didn't sleep. I was a wreck. I was in too much emotional pain to sleep, to be honest. I was so emotionally distressed. I could not sleep most of the time. But then things started to get a little better, and I had a baby, and people said sleep when the baby sleeps, and I'm autistic, so I took that very literally. And so I did, and not including those first 3 or 4 weeks, but after that, I literally got more sleep sleeping when the baby sleeps with a newborn than I did in college. It was bananas. And my life changed. Getting enough sleep will change your life. And I know it's one of those things that's really irritating when it works. It's sort of like when people say, oh, go outside. And you're like, okay. And then you go outside and you're like, dang it, I feel better. But sleep really does help. So that's the second thing. And the third is something called EFT tapping. So EFT stands for Emotional Freedom Techniques. And EFT tapping is when you tap these really specific spots, mostly on your face. And as you tap, you talk yourself through the emotion you're experiencing that's giving you difficulty. And I know it sounds really out there and silly, but there's a ton of research showing that it's very effective, especially for anxiety and trauma.
Wow. And do you think with sleep, having, getting enough sleep is one thing, but having your sleep pattern be pretty consistent is important?
I think it depends on the person. I think it's more important to get the sleep that you need than it is to get that sleep at the same time. This depends on the person. But if you have the choice between getting, your full 8 hours, but it's at a weird time, or getting 3 hours, but it's at your usual time, get the 8, in my opinion. Right.
Yeah.
But it depends on the person. Like I said, I'm very ADHD forward. So a little change in my routine doesn't bug me. But for someone who's more autistic forward, they may it may not matter that they would get more sleep a different way. They have to do it the same way. And I get that.
Yeah. I'm also curious about you mentioned let me think of, my brain's coming back to it. When someone is grieving, not having emotional support, and I heard you say on one of your YouTube episodes, do you call them episodes? You probably do. I know on podcasts they're
videos,
called
just a video.
videos, YouTube videos. Yeah, I guess that's what it is. That's what I called it before I started thinking of recording some. So, but on one of your YouTube videos, you were talking about if you didn't have the emotional support. So even somebody diagnosed with ADHD in her 40s or 50s, she didn't have the support by experts, and maybe the experts just didn't know, but you were allowing in that to not shift blame on people, but just kind of recognize I needed support, and I didn't get it for whatever reason. Do you spend much time thinking about where that support should have come from, or is it more just recognizing and grieving it and trying to heal by doing that? Does that make sense? Does it need to have a specific person it's directed to, or is it more just understanding that would have been really helpful if I could have had that then? There are things that I look back through that aren't even related to ADHD, emotionally, just not understanding relationships, when I started dating or that kind of thing. And I think, gosh, my daughters are so much more stable with that than I was. I was attaching myself to ideas that weren't even real. And you know what I mean? Like, if I had a better understanding about that then, it would have been so much better. And it took me a long time to heal from that emotionally. So I'm just wondering how your approach is with that.
So the grief does not have to be attached to a person. I know we usually attach grief to losing a person, but it can be attached to losing a sense of yourself or a version of yourself that you feel should have been able to exist, but didn't get the support that you needed. And I definitely think part of my process is absolutely, like, I think a key part of grief is rage, right?
Mm-hmm.
There is so much rage involved in grief, like rage that it shouldn't be this way, it just shouldn't be this way, right? And I think it's okay to get mad at specific people. Doesn't mean you need to tell them,
Yeah.
I mean, you can if you need to,
Yeah.
for sure. But I think there's a lot of value in writing letters you'll never send. There's a lot of value in giving yourself space to be maybe a bad person in the amount of rage you feel, and recognizing that you're actually not a bad person. You just have big emotions, and maybe they're not emotions you want others to see, but that doesn't mean you can't feel them. It doesn't mean they're bad. It doesn't mean you're bad.
Yeah. And it's going through that process of seeing what it was, how you feel. Maybe you felt it then, but weren't able to even express that, or you didn't understand enough to know that, But yeah, I was thinking about, I haven't done a lot of meditations, but when I was doing my yoga training, we experienced different meditations. And one of them, it was the last one, and he said, this can be really emotional for a lot of people. And I thought, oh, okay. And with ADHD, a lot of times, because you talked about in your videos too about the logical brain, and then, the other, that sometimes my logical brain would be, even before I tried yoga, I won't like this. I'm just going to be making fun of the teacher in my mind. Like when a teacher would say growing up, everybody close their eyes. I think, I don't want to close my eyes. Like, I'm not thinking about it, So I thought I would have that logical response and thinking too much. And I didn't. I ended up loving yoga. And so with meditation too, I wondered, like, how will this be good? But one of the things that he had us do was think through something that was extremely challenging emotionally, and thought through it and go back to that person and help them through it and tell them, give them the support. And and I don't even remember exactly now what it was. It was so big at the time. It carried with me for years. But I remember when you talk about the rage, I don't know if it went to a specific person or what, but I did, and I just cried and sobbed. And when I came out of the meditation, I couldn't hear anybody else, but everybody was crying, because you were able to go through that process of supporting yourself from a new place of understanding and getting mad if you needed to get mad. And anyway, I don't know if that's anything related, but it is very, very powerful.
Yeah,
Super
inner
powerful.
child work is amazing, especially if you have like childhood wounds that need tending.
Yeah.
Wounds don't get better with time necessarily, they get better with care.
Yeah.
And, so we need to tend to those wounds.
Yeah. And mine wasn't even child. It was just not quite an adult yet.
Yeah,
Like things can
yeah.
happen like when you just haven't figured things out, and then you start to put the pieces together. And sometimes it can take years and decades to put the pieces together. You learn one piece and it carries you through the next decade. You learn another piece and you think that makes even more sense now, as we learn and grow and everything. But, oh, yes. So one thing I want to ask and maybe you weren't able to do this as a child, I don't know if you still have any times that publicly or just with somebody else around, if someone has an emotional, what we might call an outburst, something that comes out more volcano force, and sometimes there's guilt, sometimes there's sorrow, sometimes there's embarrassment. As an adult, how can are there any things to help manage that? Help someone with feelings of guilt so that doesn't consume them, guilt, shame, embarrassment?
Yeah, I think it's sort of like what you were saying before about like crying. We're always trying to get people to stop crying. If somebody is
Mm-hmm.
having a bit of a meltdown, I think don't try to get them to stop, because that is, if anything, it's just going to lead to a shutdown then, which is not helpful either. Obviously, we do want to prioritize safety. So if someone is harming themselves or others, like we do want to
Mm-hmm.
try to rein that in. But instead of trying to get them to stop, like shutting it down, I think it's more helpful to redirect. Like, okay, I see you're banging your head against the wall. I understand how much pain you must be in order to do
Mm-hmm.
that to yourself. Like, let's see if we can get this out another way. Like, let's see if we can find a way to get this out without hurting you, because you don't deserve to be hurt. And like letting, so I think a big thing is just don't try to get it to stop. Instead, just try to get it to be safe.
Yeah,
That would be
yeah.
the thing I recommend.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking too, if you're a mother and you have a child, whether a teenager child or not, sometimes just taking them to a different setting where maybe
Mm,
they aren't as affected by other people or being observed by as many people, because certain situations just get them away where that can help them continue, but not maybe affect as many other people, or even themselves by being in that situation, because sometimes things do happen and you think, I wish this wasn't happening now, like it might be healthy to happen, but not here, not now.
and really having that conversation after, when they're in a calmer space, like, hey, the reason I moved you was not because I'm embarrassed of you. The reason I moved you is
Mm-hmm.
because some people don't deserve to see you at your most vulnerable. They haven't
Yeah.
earned that.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, because that can be seen like the mother is more embarrassed for herself as a mom. So she's trying to remove this child, and there are times I just, as a mom, I'm glad that even though my era of parenting wasn't as aware mentally as with mental health as we are now, because I see my daughter with her children, and it's like it's okay if you're angry. I can see that you're angry, but we aren't going to be able to do that. She'll let them express their emotions, but let them know that the situation hasn't changed because of your emotion. But if you need to be angry or something. But anyway, back to that. I did find it helpful sometimes just to even just get, like you said, going outside and taking a walk is helpful. A change of scenery, or just not put into a place. There was a day that I was getting all of my kids ready for school. I don't know if all 6 were in school. Probably not. I probably still had a toddler or 2, but everyone was just going crazy emotionally, like it wasn't balanced. And instead of trying to reel it in and push them in the car and say, get your backpacks and let's go, I said, it sounds like we need to have a mental health day and everyone just stay home. And they all just looked like the tension just went like this. And I said, there are days that you don't go to school because physically you're not feeling well. And I think today emotionally, we might do better just not, like having a rest day at home. And it was really, really nice, And my daughter told me that helped her see that she could do that in college. She could do that in life with her job. I might have to go off of Instagram when I've been present there or somewhere else and just say, I'm taking some time for my mental health.
Yeah.
And letting people, showing your children, patterning for them that your health is more important than the expectations of the world. We even had one time, because we went to church every Sunday, and there was an expectation of, you get there, you dress a certain way, you go there. And this one Sunday, sometimes my husband and I both had a meeting that was an hour before church. And I put my kids in the car with one of those TVs that had the VCR, just the video input. And they watched a Disney video while I was in the meeting. Then I came out and brought them in. And on the way there, another, kind of just people fighting and not happy and everything. And so I turned onto the freeway instead and took them toward the beach. And they were like, "What are you doing, Mom?" And I said, "I'm not going to go to my meeting." And they said, "But Mom, you have to go to your meeting." And I'm like, "No, I don't. I need to take care of you. Like we need to take, I can see that this isn't good for you, for me to push and put you in this situation." And we drove to the edge of a cliff where we could see the birds and just rolled down all the windows and just sat there and looked at the ocean. And we didn't even like physically go to the beach. But as a mom, I felt like so happy that I could see that.
Yeah.
Because I don't know, you know with yourself when you push, it's not good. It's not good when you're not emotionally stable to do that. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I don't know. I guess we should kind of reel it in. But do you have anything else, like any advice for women navigating ADHD or autism? Just any kind of parting words, maybe if they're even curious of one or the other, any advice you might give? And also, I one thing that I feel bad about is when women are diagnosed or they're figuring it out, a lot of times they feel like, "Oh, so this is what's wrong with me." And I think, no, it's not what's wrong with you. It is learning about yourself. So I don't know if you have anything that can be supportive, any advice that can be helpful to women, still curious about their brains and putting those pieces together.
Yeah, I know for me, when I had this realization, like I can vividly remember where I was, what I was doing. Like it was the summer of 2016 and I was at my secretary job. I was like, I worked the front desk for the communications school over the summer. And I was sitting there and I was just feeling all of my emotions and they were all over the place. And up until that point, I had really struggled with the idea that because I felt such intense highs and such intense lows, it kind of felt like they just evened each other out and it felt like I wasn't even real. My emotions weren't real. None of it mattered because I feel everything. So who cares, right? Mm-hmm. And I had this realization sitting there at the front desk. I was like, wait a minute, that's not how ups and downs work. That's not how a mountain range works. The valleys and the peaks don't cancel each other out to flat. It creates like a beautiful landscape. And are my emotions always beautiful? No, sometimes they suck, but I am real and they do matter. And I just really encourage you to, like, with juggling this potentially for some of you new ADHD diagnosis or reality for you, don't try to become neurotypical because first of all, we can't do it.
It's not possible.
Second of all, it's just not a thing. It's not how your brain works. It's not how it's wired, and that's okay. Yeah. And I just want to reinforce that there are different types of, what's the word? Like landscapes. Some people are mountain ranges. Some people are tornadoes. Some people are beautiful golden plains or there's all kinds of people, and it's okay for you to just be the type of person you are.
Yeah, I love that. I love that with seeing nature, and sometimes a lovely plain and meadow is beautiful too, but you can't force yourself to be a meadow. You really can't. I've shared a story on the podcast before about how when I was in third grade, the night before school started, I was that young, and I was the only girl, so I had my own room, and I sat in bed and thought, this year I'm going to be shy. I wanted to be shy so bad because I talked too much. I blurted out the answers and I wanted the teacher to call on me. There's some of that, like I always felt like a teacher was like a personal conversation. I wanted to have that conversation, and she didn't want to hear from me anymore because I was always raising my hand. And so I went to school the next day and sat there at my desk, and I have the distinct memory of looking at my desk, looking at the clock, looking at my desk, looking at the clock. And I couldn't do it. I gave up on that goal by lunchtime. I thought there is no way you can do this. And, when you go back and you look at your report cards and talks too much or asks to go to the bathroom all the time, because I was always wanting to leave the room. And, those things are a part of you. And I'm glad I learned at that age that I couldn't change it. Most people don't, and they try to fit in, and it's not easy for sure. It's not easy, but it's nice too, I think, too, to talk to people who love you and get feedback from them, because usually those things that somebody might think, if I were just like this, they say, but that's what I love about you. That's what I enjoy about you. And even if not everybody loves it about you, to know that people appreciate people with peaks and valleys and, you know, different emotions, different ways. And I know I had earbuds in when I was watching your videos this morning, and I was just smiling and giggling and just loving so many things, not just appreciating what you say, because you are really good at explaining information and you have a lot of understanding and wisdom with everything. But also, I think it's just helpful to hear someone talk who does things like I do, you know, or you know, to be able to relate to that. I had a woman wrote to me and told me that when she listens to the podcast, she laughs when I go, you know, and ramble, because she's like, oh, I do that too. I do that too. Yeah. And if any of you do this, I told Megan this before we started, if you go back and remember 2016 or third grade with full detail and what your shoes your teacher was wearing, that Megan remembers things too. And it's fun to hear that, because so many people are like, I don't remember all that. I'll ask my husband, do you remember this? And he's like, of course I don't. That was 15 years ago. How would I remember it? And I give him every detail of who said what and everything. But anyway, I guess just to end, Megan, tell us how to find you. And you had something you wanted to share, a freebie that people could get to help them.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so I created something called the Mental Breakdown Survival Guide. It's a totally free audio course. So basically you go through and you just listen to these little snippets. I believe the sections are help, everything hurts and I'm dying. Okay, I feel a little better, but what do I do next? And then, okay, I'm ready to deal with these emotions. I think those are the vibes. So I highly recommend you go check that out. I will give Renee the link so that you can go get that. And then if you would like to follow me elsewhere, I really recommend checking out my YouTube channel. It's just the Neurocuriosity Club. I'm pretty sure I'm the only one with that name. So come check me out there.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. I'm excited. And I'll put that link in the show notes or whatever the description is. I don't know if they're technically show notes or not. But I am so excited you came on here. Before we started, I thought, oh, I'm already hoping you can come back again and I don't know if you have time for that, but it's just so many questions and, you know, your wealth of information and fun to have on here. So thanks so much. And everyone else, give me some likes, some downloads, follow me, find me on YouTube. This will be on YouTube before it's on audio. I'm not great with all my outro things because I don't remember them all. But you know where to find me, Renee